we've got a couple folks with us. I'll introduce them. First of all, thanks to Defense One and to Raytheon for putting this on. So we've got the middle, Vice Admiral retired Joseph Dyer, who is currently the Chief Strategy Officer from the National Spectrum Association, formerly the Navy's Senior Acquisition Officer. So we have to talk to that more. On the far side, we've got Lieutenant General retired Trey Obring, who's currently Executive Vice President of Booz Allen Hamilton, and of course the former MDA Director. And right here we've got Dr. Mitch Stevenson, Vice President for Air and Missile Systems for Raytheon Missile Systems. Gentlemen, why don't we get it started? And I thought we'd kick it off really with the discussion that was just handled on the last panel. You know, the BMDR from 2010 says Homeland Missile Defense is a top priority. Puts it right there at the top. The attention to that has bounced around a little bit over the last 10 years or so. So I wonder if you might, I'll throw this to General Obering first. What do we need to do? I think MDA is kind of 2013 timeframe, hitting an inflection point. We're seeing a lot more attention going on there in terms of reliability, in terms of the RKB, things like that. What's next for home? What comes? What do we need to do to not only just stay on the track that MDA is on now, but what can we do beyond that?
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate being here. This reminds me a little bit of church on Christmas Day. Without the bar, even though I am Catholic. So I was just sitting there thinking, I have now been in missile defense for 15 years this December, which is kind of scary, especially for a former fighter pilot coming into this career field. But I will tell you that I'm very excited about where the program is based on where we began, especially those many years ago. And I think that what we should be doing, and you heard some of that with General Cooley, Mr. Johnson, the first thing for the Homeland Defense is to laser-like focus on the reliability, which is what they're doing with the RKB program that was mentioned. And I think that's important because I think that's it's technology that's well in hand, and it actually is completing what was originally intended to be a part of the entire program, which were spiral developments of the interceptors that were placed in the field beginning in 2004, continued evolution of those that were stopped and halted for a while, and now getting back to that and getting to where we need to get. I will say that we can't stop there because even threats like Iran and North Korea are continuing to evolve, and they're getting more and more advanced threat suites. They're demonstrating capabilities that we are worried about being able to defend against. So if we sit on our laurels just with what we have, it's not going to be enough. We've got to go to, in my opinion, the ability to address those more advanced threat suites. That means being able to do discrimination and take care of highly advanced threat suites, which means that we need a sensor architecture that allows us birth-to-death tracking so that we can do that as part of that challenge. And also, no matter how good we're going to get in our sensors and our radar algorithms and all of that, we're never going to get 100%. And we can say in an advanced threat suite every time, that's the KB, or that's the warhead. So we're going to have a multiple kill capability to take care of multiple credible objects from a single threat missile. And I think the MOKV program that the agency is involved with is exactly intended to do that. And I believe that we have to have an urgency about this because of what we see happening in the threat world. And I think, unfortunately, we've been hunkered down so long in budget that we've got to get beyond that. We've got to get, in my opinion, we've got to get over the sequestration that originated out of OMB. We've got to get over that, and we've got to start funding the country and funding defense the way it needs to be funded to meet the threats that we see emerging in the future.
Can I follow up with you just on that? What about the whole limited discussion? You and I were just on a panel 2 weeks ago. When you say advanced threats, you know, we just heard about hypersonics a minute ago. What do you mean there?
Well, it's pretty straightforward. And I go back to basics. I think the primary goal of the federal government is to protect the people. National security is the primary goal. And we can't select the threats that we're going to defend against. We need to defend against all the threats. And if we have a policy that states, and I know why the limited word is there, I was there, and I can go into that if you like. But if that is inhibiting us to address a more belligerent Russia, a very aggressive China, which has one of the most aggressive missile development programs of any nation on earth, then we need to remove it. And we need to get on with building the defenses that this country needs to make sure that we're viable into the future.
Well, gentlemen, it is the top priority, so I'd like to weigh in on the Homeland side, what's being done there, what we ought to be doing.
Yeah, sure. I think General Overy, he nailed it. I mean, from birth to death. I mean, that's where we're at, what we have to do here. I mean, he says we got to break it down in a simple context. I mean, but it's not a simple context. We have to break it down so people understand it in a simple context, but it's certainly not there. The one thing I would add, I mean, I could add a lot. I do think he did such a marvelous job in that answer. But one of the opportunities that we immediately have within our system is there is so much capacity and capability that I think that we're not looking at and mining within the existing system. And when you look at our opportunities with our sensor suites that we have today, we need more. I mean, General Overy is correct. We can't cover everything right now. But within our current sensor systems, we can't simply throw data on the floor and not use it to make better decisions on what we want to do with our limited effectors. So I think that's one area that we need to do more work to, but we can't ignore the advancing threat, yet there's a balance of we can't ignore the existing threat. And if you start paying for one with the other, we're going to put some vulnerabilities out there that we're going to have to address. And hopefully we won't get to that point because, as General Overy also pointed out, if we get the right budgets, we can deal with all of that. And we talk about cost curves, and I'll be surprised if we get off this panel without talking about cost curves. And they certainly exist, but we can't be absent that there are vulnerabilities that will be created if the budget's not done correctly.
Well, first of all, you've courageously invited 2 fighter pilots to join your panel, which I think speaks well about some aspects of your planning. I guess I should also start with an apology, because I'm one of the folks that when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union crumbled, I actually thought the world was going to be a better and safer place. And it is with huge disappointment that I noticed that that's just not the case. There's the Russian problem, and there are many other problems. There does seem to be a bottomless pit of bad guys with whom to deal. I would amplify or support Mitch's comment about it's a responsibility of the government and industry to attend to both today and tomorrow. Those of you that are in business know that you can't sacrifice the long term for the near term if you are to be an ongoing concern. The same is true, I believe, in the defense of the nation. I'm an outsider to missile defense. I come from the fighter community in naval aviation. And you know, you talk about reliability. I am in awe of the terribly difficult things done by the missile defense community and the ability to prosecute them with the reliability you do demonstrate. SM3 numbers just amaze me. Certainly agree and understand there needs to be a tiered approach of cost and threat, but if you war game it out, you have to start with what cost Seattle. Thank you.
And that's why it's not so much the cost curve with the cost of the interceptor against the cost of the threat missile, but the cost of what you're protecting. The affordability curve is another way to put it. Well, the Homeland regional dichotomy is perhaps an artificial one, but it's one we're stuck with. So let me shift to the bucket of things that falls under regional. You know, it was mentioned earlier that the demand signal for these things, from COCOMs, from our partners, is well outstripping supply. You know, that was predicted back in the 2010 BMDR when things seemed peaceful and a lot better than they are today. How do we come at this? Is it a capacity question? Is it a cheaper interceptor question? Are there other ways of attacking that problem, that capacity problem, that demand signal problem, that involve cutting up cutting up our solutions and mixing and matching them in different ways. You know, I was talking about IBCS a minute ago. This any sensor, any shooter thing. What other ways of coming at this exist that we got to think about? You know?
Well, first of all, that has been part of the vision since the beginning, was to have an integrated layered missile defense system. And in fact, many people don't realize this, but we first looked at what is now known as Aegis Ashore many years ago when I was director, and we looked at it actually for a solution in Israel at the time. And we wanted to marry the kinetic range of the SM-3 missile with the radar range of the THAAD radar, because we thought that would be a good blend for increased capability. So that's something that we've looked at, and we've tried to go down those roads in the past. But I believe that one of the keys is focus on the integrated command and control and the integration of those systems. We actually did some testing, and we've run some actual integration tests between NATO ACTS and CTBMC, for example, to bring in some of our partner nations. I think IBCS, as was mentioned earlier by Mr. Johnson, I think that in integrating with CTBMC, getting at that ability to take any sensor and any shooter, I think is very, very important. Also, if we get, for example, a space-based sensor system that is capable of intercept quality data, that goes a long way, because now you can feed that to any of the systems, whether they're terrestrially based or whatever, to be able to improve their performance and their capability. So I think that as we think through things in the future, I think the architecture we look at and the integration of the command and control of these is important and critical.
You mentioned, you kind of alluded to this.
Yeah. I mean, I'll certainly jump in there, and I'll try to give a little bit more of a specific example of 2 points around that example. In my portfolio, the SM-6 missile, I think is really one that bears out this any sensor, any shooter kind of construct that we want to get to. But beyond that, the first point I'll make is it's beyond just looking at if we're really worried about cost curves. The Navy's starting to refer to things like distributed lethality and how do you get the most out of your current systems. When you look at the evolution of SM-6, initially it was just part of the Navy's concept for extended air protection for their naval strike groups. Where is it today? It now is that extended capability for AAW, or anti-air warfare, but it's also sea-based terminal, defending against some of the most obvious threats that we can talk about in the terminal phase, and now it's got an anti-surface capability. So when you look at where we need to go and where we may need to think about from a missile defense standpoint, and this community is so critical in the evolution of where the missile defense system began and where it is today and where it will be in the future. You heard Mr. Johnson talk about left of launch. We hear that all the time. We have to start thinking about that within our missile defense system to have that kind of capability to go left of launch, whether it is with kinetic capabilities or whether it is with something like a high microwave system. We have to get there. So I think that's point one. The second point is in our existing systems today, I look at what has changed from when those earlier studies were done about looking at a Standard Missile 3 inside of a THAAD system. And again, from an engineering standpoint, we all know it's doable. It's not a feat of a great leap to be able to integrate a Standard Missile 3 into a THAAD fire construct. What's changed is the threat has evolved tremendously. I think we need to, if we're really being innovative, and we're really an innovative community, I mean, under the leadership of people like General Overeem and others, this community has been one of the most innovative communities in the DoD. We've got to start looking at now, what does it mean to do that? And then what does it mean if we were to put a Standard Missile, from an innovation standpoint, into a THAAD system? What else could we do? We talk about cost curve. So, from that launcher, with that launcher capability, you immediately start bringing in lower tier systems in the Navy layered systems that you could put in to deal with the lower tier threats and do it within that same fire control construct. So we have to start thinking about that. The innovation requires us, but the threat is requiring us to look at those things, and we need to start doing it, I think, a lot quicker than we are today.
Which, oh, by the way, I think is the real answer to the cost curve. Any sensor, any shooter on steroids is an approach to a new way of doing business. I have to tell you, I think the missile defense community is a little late to that game. vis-a-vis some of the other communities. I'll give you a quick aircraft development story. The F-18EF was developed quickly and urgently with a very limited amount of R&D funding, limited at least by Joint Strike Fighter standards. I'll not say anything else on the subject. But when we were doing F-18EF, we looked at reducing observables, we looked at the visual range combat equations, and we said, you know, vectored thrust really helps a lot in the enclosed fight, but it's very hot back there, and it's very expensive, and the reliability's low. So we said, how else could we do it? And then we looked at helmet-mounted sight and AIM-9X, and had a missile that could come off the rail, make the turn at 90 Gs, and actually attack an adversary in the rear hemisphere. Capability I've always needed. So this looking across the board at multiple weapon systems, multiple sensors, integrated together as a package, I think is the answer to the cost curve.
And isn't that, I mean, it goes after the cost curve, but it's also kind of it's a multi-mission, right? The multi-mission attitude that hasn't MDA been slow to that, in part quite deliberately. So as to, we don't want those GBIs and Poland to look like anything but GBIs.
Trust
They're
me.
Purely defensive.
Trust me, so it was very deliberate, and it was deliberate for a reason. The first one was B&D is tough. It's tough. And we did not want to get diluted or diverted by including too many other missions in that. We wanted to be laser focused on being able to defeat, you know, short, medium, and long range missiles to be able to do that. And I remember, and even in a lot of the other elements of the system, I remember I was briefed in the JROC, and I was talking about our STSS, Space Tracking and Surveillance System birds, and 2 demos that we were putting up right after I left. And the vice chairman asked me, as soon as I finished the briefing, he said, well, what else can they do? And I said, absolutely nothing. Because I did not want this expansion of requirements, you know, to delay that any further. But having said that, once you've got your feet on the ground and you've cut your teeth, now you can begin to do a lot of these things that we know we need to do for you know, reducing the cost curve, et cetera. Not the least of which, by the way, in an area that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to is defensive, offensive integration. We've got some really high quality sensors. They could be very useful to an offensive force. And I mean that both at the tactical and strategic level. And I think that we need to place a lot more focus on that integration of offense and defense, because it does a lot. Number one, it strengthens deterrence considerably. Number two, you make me realize you're not going to sit there and just take shot after shot after shot after shot and try to build a permanent dome, which is never going to happen anyway. And number three, it helps the offense. So I think that there's a really good, that's an area that I think that we can actually use some industry help in thinking through.
And that's, I think, really speaks to the maturity of missile defense. You know, NBA's been around for 14 years. It's one thing to talk about that today, about SM-6 or expand radars doing different things, but it's a lot harder,
Right.
Harder than 2001, 2002 time frame. Let me go to one particular area of regional missile defense where that kind of, I would say, deliberate, I've already talked about it, it's Europe, it's NATO. You know, to what extent, in the light of whether it's additional troop deployments to Baltics, to Poland, but putting in 1,000 more troops there, as we look forward to the next administration, and Congress is apparently requiring a report on integration. How do we think about our missile and air defenses for NATO? Ought we, and this is a little more of a policy question, but ought we not be thinking about defending forward forces against things that come from the east or come from the north? Anybody want to take that one?
I'll jump in on it. I mean, certainly I can tell you a couple of months ago, 3-4 months ago, I gave a speech at the RUSI conference, and it was within the context of the NATO alliance, and what more does the NATO alliance need to do within its own construct without the U.S. having to do it all for them? And quite frankly, I politely challenged the NATO people there that were attending the conference that you need to get your policy aligned. Number one, you got to get there. You got to get your budgets aligned. You've promised for a long time to to get your defense budgets aligned with a certain percentage of your GDP. You've got to get there. But absent that, I mean, there is some certain slowness to the political systems in Europe to maneuver in those areas. We have to be thinking about that. I mean, we see what the Russians are doing. It makes a lot of sense to me in the history of studying back through the Baltics and the different cultures and alliances that exist there, amongst the people, that the Russians are being aggressive there. And I was sharing with Admiral Dyer earlier at a conference not long after Secretary Gates left the Secretariat and moved into the private sector. He spoke at a conference I was at, and he was kind of jovial. He was just out of his job for a few weeks, and then somebody asked a question from the audience: "What do you think about Putin?" And his demeanor immediately stopped, and he just got really dead serious. And he looked and said, President Bush asked me, what did I think about Putin? This was what President Bush said. I looked at Putin and I thought I saw a friend. And he said, I looked at him and I said, sir, I look at Putin and I see a killy-eyed stiller, a stilly-eyed killer, I'm sorry. And that has always resonated with me. If we don't believe, and we see inside of the European construct now, 3 or 4 years ago, none of them wanted to talk about the Russian aggression. As a matter of fact, they didn't want to do anything because they were scared of what the Russians may do in retaliation. Now they see what they've done. There's a push there. We, the United States, have got to take a firm position on, if we're going to move forces forward, if we're going to do these things to support our allies, we have the most capability today. We just have to understand that. We've got to commit to that, in my opinion. And that's, like you said, it's a policy question. And I'm not the guy to go talk about United States policy. I'm probably the least qualified up here to talk about U.S. policy. But we, in my humble opinion, can't sit back and let our friends and allies in the region feel unprotected. We can't do that. That's not what this country was built on.
So I'll add on to that. So when I first traveled and briefed the full NATO Council in 2003. It's when we rolled out at that time the third site interceptors in Poland and the Czech radar. And I can tell you that from that first, and I briefed them about, I think a total between the NATO Council and the NATO Russia Council about 12 times over my tenure. And I saw the change in the NATO partners over that time frame, about initially dismissing the threat as not being real, to accepting that the threat is real, and just beginning to start to wring their hands about what they were going to do. Now, under that construct, we were going to provide the longer range protection. They were going to be focused on the shorter range protection. And I think that there needs to be a lot more energy placed back on that, on them building out, because that helps in the cost, that helps in capability and capacity and everything else. But I think there needs to be a focused initiative to do that. And the U.S. has got to be at the heart of that to try to push that.
NATO's come a long way.
They have.
And I should be. I was kind of hard on the NATO. They have done a lot. I mean, you look at the Aegis Ashore deployments in both Poland and Romania. What that really means. I mean, the forethought that was put into that. It was hard for those countries to accept those facilities, although they're U.S. funded and U.S. led. It was hard for them to accept those in their countries. They came against some resistance within NATO, and but you see things down like Spain entertaining our Aegis ships there for the BMD mission. You see some interest this recent at-sea demonstration where we actually launched an SM-3 in European waters for the first time ever. I mean, outside of a U.S. contract, you see them moving in the direction that we need to go. I think it's still going to require U.S. leadership to get us over the goal line.
There's not a fixed remote asset in Europe as Russia has the threat. Something to do with it.
I spent an immersion day a few months ago with a number of the NATO attaches down in southern Maryland. And there were 3 takeaways to me in that forum. The first was there is a shift in perspective. There still is concern about poking the bear and how that sometimes can lead to more stress rather than less. But there is also a recognition that between the risk of escalation and depending upon the good graces of the current Russian leadership, they're willing to come down on the side of building a creditable defense, except, and the except is, Trey, your comment about we as a nation have to insist upon the investment necessary to build the systems to protect our peoples and our interest. There is white-faced fear on behalf of many of the NATO nations that they cannot muster the resources to hold up their end of the party. We're going to have to insist that they invest as well. They are in many ways on the front line, certainly in Europe. The philosophy is coming, the technology is coming, the resources aren't. One other thing, and Mitch is the Army rep on this panel, something that came up again and again from the attaches was concern about concentration of forces in Europe in a world of cruise missiles. Something that needs more thought and more inventory investment than it currently has.
Including reliance on very few sensors. Well, we're standing between us and the bar, and I want to close it out with just a real quick comment about the kind of systems that we use, NATO or elsewhere, to go after those kind of short-range threats. And that means, you know, the BADS, the Patriots, the SM-6s, in terms of endo-atmospheric kills. What kind of concerns, thoughts about both capacity and modernization? We'll hear about that this week with the Army. For those kinds of, especially endo, lower tier threats. You lost me?
Well, I've been batting cleanup, so I'll go first.
Well, I'll just repeat real quick, comments on especially the lower tier FAD, Patriot, and SM-6 kind of things.
Let me back into it and let these two experts speak directly to it. I'm concerned about the balance between today's threat and tomorrow's threat. And concerned, frankly, about, I'm both interested, excited, and worried about the discussion of MDA turning to a focus on R&D and distributing production to the services. You know, when budgets are hard, we love R&D. We love it because, frankly, it's cheaper than production, and you can pretend you're doing perhaps more than you are. You have to maintain that balance. I love my Navy, but if we put missile defense procurement in Navy, I predict to you from having lived there for many years, it's going to come behind ships and airplanes. And in today's world, is that the right and best approach?
So I'll chime in. What we began fielding in 2004, and we have been fielding since then, was not money that we invested in 2004. It was money we invested in 1980 and 1990. And we can't stop doing that. We've got to stay ahead of the threat. We have to expand, and you have seen, in fact, Tom wrote a very, very well done article from CSIS on the shrinking R&D budget of MDA. And we recognized that when we stood up MDA. We knew that eventually there would have to be, at that time we said, a transition from MDA to the services for full rate production, O&M, and sustainment, or not, sustainment engineering would remain with MDA. But as you point out, we've also seen where that didn't work out, at least in one case, because the services have higher priorities that gets sucked into. So and as Tom points out, there's three options. One is to stay the course, which I don't think is executable. I think we will eat our seed corn and we will not be able to address emerging threats. Number two would be to transition to the services, and the only way that would be successful is that money was fenced, and that any change from that would have to require approval from MDA and Congress or whatever. Or the third is that MDA become a combat support agency, or combat support command, which is, there are precedents for doing that. I think those latter two are the only two really options that they have going forward. But my point is this: we've got to regrow the R&D budget back to where it needs to be. And that's really, if you look at the MDA budgets over the last 16 years or whatever, there was a dramatic shift from 2000, 2008, or 2001 to 2008, and then from 2008 to present day, or 2009, there's been a dramatic cut. We just have to restore that back to still less than 2% of our overall defense budget. For an existential threat, less than 2% of our defense budget is not much to spend. And if we would do that, back to a $10 billion figure, I think you can begin to address some of these problems that we've been talking about all afternoon.
Close this out.
I just, I would say that, it certainly the discussion about the sustainment of the systems, as General Overeem and Admiral Dower just pointed out, it's about the budget. It's not about the will. It's not about the desire within the agency to do the right thing. Your article that you wrote, you really covered the range of options, but much like General Overeem, I feel that the lower end of that is not tenable. I agree, as much as I work with the Navy now, and the Navy's got a great, sense and acute understanding of the threat evolution and the procurements of systems to deal with those. If the missile defense mission, from a procurement standpoint, evolves into the Navy, you will see the priorities go to ships and to airplanes, and rightfully from their big portfolio and their broad responsibilities. A blue ocean Navy, that's probably the right place for them to be. I think that's why the Missile Defense Agency was created. Now there's great challenges across integrating these systems across the services and making sure that the warfighter is equipped, whether you wear a green uniform or a blue uniform or a white uniform, or whatever color uniform you wear, that you can work within that construct seamlessly. That is the challenges that are ahead, and the sustainment of these systems. If the budget is elevated, as General Overeem just pointed out, just back to levels it was, that can all be accomplished effectively. And again, what are we at right now? From our DoD budget, we're spending about 1.3% of our whole entire DoD budget on missile defense. And when you look at what our adversaries are spending the bulk of their money on trying to influence our policy, influence our actions, it's on their missile capabilities. So we have to think about that very strongly.
Well, thank you all, gentlemen, and I hope you all will join me in thanking the panel.